Hello, and welcome to a self-guided audio tour of Bournemouth. The tour will take you to some of the most interesting tourist sites of this vibrant seaside resort. There are a total of 9 audio points, and each is clearly marked on the accompanying map, and each audio track finishes with clear details as to where you should walk next. These details or instructions are often given as major buildings, but sometimes include local landmarks or retailers. You can complete the tour in one go if you wish, and this should take you about 90 minutes. However, you can also pick and choose by finding individual audio points. The start and finish of each track is marked by the following sound. I do hope you'll enjoy the tour, but please be aware of your surroundings at all times, as you'll be passing through busy pedestrian areas and crossing busy roads. The tour begins at Audio Point 1, the Royal Exeter Hotel. Audio Point 1, the Royal Exeter Hotel. You should now be at Audio Point 1, outside the Royal Exeter Hotel, on Exeter Road, just up from the Bournemouth International Centre. Imagine, if you can, standing on this spot over 2 centuries ago. The scene would bear little resemblance to what you see now. At that time, the area was known as Bourne, and was a rather desolate area. It consisted mainly of swampy valleys and wild heathlands, and there was a stream called the Bourne draining into the sea. Fewer than 400 people lived here, and the only settlement of the area was by cows, gypsies and a few fishermen living in basic timber-framed cottages. Much of the local land was in the possession of Sir George Ivson Taps Jervis, Lord Mayor of Christchurch Manor. He had acquired 445 acres after the passing of the Local Enclosure Act in 1802. It was an area that a certain Louis Tregonwell knew well. He'd patrolled as a captain of the local yeomanry, watching for signs of Napoleon's threatened invasion. Tregonwell's early years were traumatic, and after the early death of his first wife Catherine, in February 1794, Louis married Henrietta Portman. In 1807, Henrietta gave birth to a son the couple decided to name Grosvenor. But the baby suffered a tragic sudden death on the very day he was to be baptised. And at this point the story goes that the distraught mother became ill with grief. A few years later, in 1810, after retiring from the army, Tregonwell and Henrietta would spend more and more time in neighbouring Muddyford. This small village had become a select sea bathing area and was well known for its recuperative qualities. Louis hoped that his wife might regain some measure of her previous happiness, and he remembered from his time serving in the area that Bourne also offered beautiful coastline, fresh air and attractive approaches to the sea. Perhaps he thought this area could further assist in Henrietta's recovery. And so it was that whilst they were staying at nearby Muddyford, that Louis took Henrietta for a ride across Bourne Heath for a view of the sea. It seems that Mrs. Tregonwell was very well taken by the place, and she suggested to her husband that it would make an excellent holiday residence. He duly set his sights upon an 8.5-acre parcel of land overlooking the Bourne. This he purchased from Lord Taps Jervis for £179. On this actual plot, Tregonwell built a villa which, when completed in 1812, quickly became known as the Mansion, and it has the distinction of being widely recognised as the first residence in Bournemouth rather than the Bourne. Now a busy and vibrant hotel, the building still actually incorporates parts of Tregonwell's original villa. To better see these, you'll need to go down into the car park. From that vantage point, look upwards. Look at the flagpoles. They're on top of the original tower, and the gables either side of the tower are the original ones too. Now back to the Tregonwells. They actually lived here until the death of Louis Tregonwell in 1832, when his widow moved out and offered it for lease. One notable tenant to take on the lease was the Marchioness of Exeter, who'd spent some time here before, and both the hotel and neighbouring road are named after her. And eventually the hotel was renamed Royal after members of the royal family stayed here. By the mid-1840s, most of the land west of the Bourne was in the possession of the Tregonwells. But by the end of the decade, Bournemouth was still little more than a community of cottage homes and villas, which had not exceeded the status of a village. Indeed, at the time of the 1851 census, the resident population of the heath was still under 700, yet 10 years later it had tripled. This ends audio point 1. To continue to audio point 2, the Tregonwell and Crab statue, turn so you face down Exeter Road in the direction of the pier. The next audio point is roughly 100 yards on the right, just past the main entrance of the Bournemouth International Centre. You're looking for a pair of statues that represent two of Bournemouth's most famous characters. Take care though, because they're quite tricky to spot. They're set back a little bit away from the pathway on a raised flower bed. Audio point 2, the Tregonwell and Creek Memorial Statue. You should now be standing just down from the main entrance of the Bournemouth International Centre at a statue commemorating two of Bournemouth's most famous characters, Lewis Tregonwell and Christopher Crab Creek. The statue was created by Jonathan Sells, an award-winning local artist from Weymouth, known for his large and often quirky and amusing pieces. His public works are often figurative pieces representing various historic anniversaries, and they often capture the emotion and mood of the people at the time. It's reported that Sells himself sees this particular example as a slice of seaside humour. The statue is 7 foot 6 inches tall and is made from Portland stone and is a popular photographic background for Bournemouth's graduates after their award ceremonies. But let's study the statue in more detail. Directly facing you is the imposing figure of Lewis Tregonwell, the founder of Bournemouth. He's seen perched upon a majestic building, which upon closer inspection is rather similar to the Bournemouth Town Hall. And he's also holding a bucket and spade. Perhaps this bucket and spade is there to suggest the pleasure that's to be had from a stay at the very fashionable seaside resort that he was instrumental in creating. On a much more serious note, the carving of Tregonwell shows him holding a scroll with the names of the 3 Bournemouth-born recipients of the Victoria Cross. Also, if you look carefully, note the running squirrels. They're near to what appears to be a smuggler's boat. However, it's the figure behind Tregonwell that appears to have the most cause for concern. Move to the back, you'll see a carving of Christopher Crab Creek. Yes, and he's sitting on a toilet bowl. So why? To find out, we have to go back to the Bournemouth Improvement Act of 1856. This act provided for improvement to paving, sewerage, drainage and lighting, covering an area of over 1,000 acres around Bournemouth. A local board of commissioners was established to organise these improvements, and Creek was appointed the first surveyor and inspector of nuisances on a grand salary of £50. Perhaps his endeavours with modern drainage were a vast improvement on the cesspools and septic tanks of the time, hence the reference to a more modern means of sewage disposal. Another role given to Creek was that of town planner, and it's his plans that directly shaped the Bournemouth you see today. Take for example the roads. Apparently he loved windy roads, bends and crescents, and you'll notice as you wander around there's very few straight roads in Bournemouth as a result. So back to the statue. Creek cuts a rather forlorn figure as he sits on his throne directly behind the more revered founder of Bournemouth. Could it be that he's rather envious of the recognition given to Tregonwell, whereas his main legacy is a pub named after him in nearby Lansdowne? Or do you think it's because he's just mulling over his next grand drainage scheme? Now let's move on a few more yards down Exeter Road to the Royal Court Hotel, which has a very close and significant association with Marconi, the pioneer of wireless communications. Now a home for retired mine workers, it used to be the site of a hotel called the Madeira. Whilst a guest at the hotel, Marconi set up an experimental transmitting station with the intention of transmitting to another one set up on the nearby Isle of Wight. And it's from that hotel that he eventually received the world's first paid radio message, which was from Lord Kelvin on the Isle of Wight. This was on the 3rd of June 1898. This ends audio point 2. To reach audio point 3, the Bournemouth Pier, carry on further down Exeter Road and enter the pier approach area via the footpath that runs past the Hot Rock Cafe. I recommend that you listen to audio point 3 by a plaque set in a stone pedestal that commemorates the building of the Undercliff Drive by the Undercliff Committee in 1907. This you'll find in a raised area surrounded by a white wall, about 10 yards down from the path leading to Harry Ramsden's. Audio point 3, the Bournemouth Pier. You should now be standing by a plaque commemorating the building of the Undercliff Drive by the Undercliff Committee in 1907. This offers a good view of the pier and its approach. The history of the Bournemouth Pier is a fascinating one, and it begins back in the time when the more usual form of transport involved uncomfortable coaches. Although boat travel was a much more comfortable way of travelling, there was the big problem for seaside towns of safely alighting at the seaside destination. This often meant wading through the sea from the ship, so originally basic mobile landing stages or jetties were used. These were later replaced by permanent fixed piers, when it was found that people rather enjoyed a walk above a raging sea. So, let's look at the current pier. Today it bears little resemblance to the original pier, having been rebuilt and modified constantly over the years. Initially, like so many other seaside areas, Bournemouth used mobile jetties on wheels as necessary. And the first pier of a more fixed nature in Bournemouth consists of a short wooden jetty that was completed in 1856. This flimsy wooden structure was replaced by a much longer wooden pier costing over £3,000. Designed by George Rennie, it opened on the 17th of September 1861 amid much pomp and ceremony, including a 21-gun salute. However, things didn't go very smoothly, and due to attack by Tredo worm, the wooden piles were removed in favour of cast iron replacements in 1866. Unfortunately, even with this additional benefit, the life of the pierhead was short-lived, as just a year later it was rendered unusable when the T-shaped landing stage at the end was swept away in a severe gale. The remaining neck was repaired, and the pier continued in use for a further 10 years, until November 1876, when another severe storm caused further collapse, rendering it too short for steamboat traffic. This affected Bournemouth rather badly, as since 1871 there had been a long association between Bournemouth Pier and pleasure steamers. In fact, to this day, the tradition continues, with regular seasonal visits by the paddle steamer Waverley and a motorised companion, the Balmoral. The Rennie Pier was subsequently demolished, and during the next 3 years a new pier, designed by Eugenius Birch, was completed at a cost of over £21,000. It opened on the 11th of August 1880, and had extensions such as covered shelters. A bandstand was added to the pier head shortly afterwards, and a new landing stage increased the pier's length to a fantastic 1,000 feet. This pier went from strength to strength and proved a great success in the early decades of the 20th century, with concerts, swimming galas proving particularly popular. In common with virtually all other piers in the south and east of the country, Bournemouth Pier was sectioned by an army demolition team in the spring of 1940. This was a precaution against German invasion during the Second World War. The pier was eventually repaired and reopened in August 1946. Refurbishment of the pier head was carried out in 1950, and 10 years later, a rebuild of the substructure was completed in concrete to take the weight of the new pier theatre. Unfortunately, a structural survey in 1976 found major areas of corrosion, and in 1979 a £1.7 million restoration programme was initiated. The old Shorewood End buildings were demolished and they were replaced with a new 2-storey octagonal leisure complex, and the pier neck was reconstructed in concrete, giving it the bridge-like appearance that it retains today. The pier came to the attention of the national press in 1993. An explosive device was found underneath the pier. It was thought to be one of 6 bombs believed to have been planted by the IRA throughout Bournemouth town centre. Nowadays, the pier offers much more adventurous pastimes than you might expect. In 2006, operation of the pier was taken over by Open Wide Limited. This company proposed great changes to the pier. They would close the pier theatre and the building would be converted into an adventurous sports attraction, complete with surf training wave, climbing walls and high rope courses. And finally, in September 2011, after many protests about the closure, including a strong defence of the theatre by national peers, Bournemouth Council voted to approve the change of use and enable the proposals to go ahead. This ends audio point 3. However, I strongly suggest you pay the modest entrance fee and spend some more time promenading the pier. There are a series of most informative information panels to view and a modern cafe where superb views of the coastline and bay can be enjoyed. To reach audio point 4, the pavilion, you'll need to turn so that your back is to the pier so that you're facing the flyover that goes over the pier approach. To the right of the underpass that goes under the flyover, you'll see a cafe called the Prom Cafe. Go past this and then immediately turn right and go up the hill towards a sign in the distance that says Bath Hill Roundabout. About 50 yards up on the left, you'll come to an entranceway to the rear car park of the pavilion. Continue up through this car park for about another 50 yards until you come to the front of the theatre building. I suggest you start audio point 4 by the fountain that's at the front. Audio point 4, the pavilion. You should now be standing outside the front of the pavilion by the fountain in the main car park. The theatre you see today was opened in 1929 and it was considered one of the finest entertainment buildings in the land. Still managed today by the local borough council, this Grade 2 listed building remains a very popular venue. The theatre had actually been 87 years in the making. There had been many years of argument, disagreement and pre-planning since 1842. Who says that local government planning rules have changed? But the foundation stone was eventually laid on the 23rd of September 1925. And when the building finally did open, there was a whole host of amenities and activities for the locals and holidaymakers. The actual opening of the new pavilion on the 19th of March 1929 was one of the greatest events that the town had witnessed. Thousands of residents lined the streets of Holdenhurst Road, Old Christchurch Road and Bourne Avenue. They welcomed the Duke of Gloucester, the first ever member of royalty to travel by public train. Hundreds of brightly coloured flags and blue, yellow and green artificial flowers hung from buildings and lamp standards. It was a truly memorable day, highlighted by glorious sunshine. The Art Deco Pavilion cost the ratepayers of Bournemouth at the time £250,000. This is about £11 million in today's world, but they really got a good deal. The interior combined elegance and comfort, with a magnificent concert hall and a beautiful tea room featuring a sprung dance floor, and there were magnificent sea views. Seawater was actually pumped from a chamber underneath the West Corridor, and it was used not only for the heating system, but also for filling the fountain in the forecourt. Right from the very beginning, the complex was a great success, and it brought all the top stars from stage, screen and later television. Another claim to fame was the fact that it had the largest soda fountain on the south coast fitted to the tea room. It was also used for running the waterfall in the gardens and for cleaning nearby Westover Road and other streets. Nowadays, the changing world of theatre means that the pavilion runs a sequence of one-night shows. These are interspersed with a resilient pantomime and longer runs of West End shows. So, what else does the pavilion have to offer? Well, to find out, we're going to have to go just round the corner to the right side of the building. Here we'll find some of Bournemouth's hidden gems. These hidden gems are in fact black granite plaques that throw a great deal of light on Bournemouth's history. Let's start with the plaques on our right. These were erected to mark the Queen's Diamond Jubilee in 2012. In total, these 16 plaques detailed Bournemouth's history using monarchs' reigns and jubilees as the timeline. The main opening explanatory plaque explains that they celebrate both the interesting history of the town and the pioneering spirit which has seen Bournemouth continue to renew itself for the challenges of each new age. They were designed by Councillor Rodney and Mrs. Elaine Cooper, and they were unveiled by Mrs. Julia Smith, great-great-great-great-granddaughter of Lewis Tregonwell, the town's founder. On the opposite wall are another set of plaques. These are dedicated to the founders of Bournemouth. They've been honoured on a series of 9 black granite plaques mounted outside the west wall of the Pavilion Theatre. A committee was set up and they spent 6 months debating who had earned a place on the Wall of Fame. The criteria is quite simple. They must have been active in the town prior to 1870, and they should have all left a legacy to be visited, may include builders, and usually would have been living in the town. This ends audio point 4. To reach audio point 5, which is the Pine Walk, retrace your steps to the wall plaques and go down a short set of steps which lead onto the Pine Walk pathway. A good reference point is the sculpture Spectra. In fact, you should be able to see it. It's only about 30 yards away in the middle of some trees. This is a 12-metre high freestanding neon light tower created by Peter Freeman. Its intense coloured rings of neon light create a spectacular spectrum of artificial light. Audio point 5, the Pine Walk. You should now be standing towards the start of the Pine Walk pathway by a sculpture called Spectra. This area is known as Pine Walk, although it's also known as Westover Gardens or Westover Shrubberies. Situated in the lower gardens, it's in the very heart of the town, and it offers a relaxing, slow-paced stroll that's a feast for the eyes. It's an English Heritage Grade 2 listed area, and it has over 2.5 million visitors a year. It's also been given the prestigious Green Flag Award. The area around was originally used for cattle grazing, and the story goes that it was also used as a haven for local smugglers. The area's first real development occurred as a result of the building of a series of exclusive detached villas along which is now Westover Road in the 1830s and 40s. Soon after, the area was planted with pine trees, and between 1836 and 1840 this area served as a private pleasure garden for the wealthy villa owners. Some 10 years later, Decimus Burton, famous for designing the Palm House at Kew Gardens, added new features. These included evergreen oaks, laurels and sweet bay trees. And so it remained a private pleasure garden until 1859, when it became Bournemouth's first public park. It became particularly popular for convalescing patients in the latter part of the 19th century, and the area was actually known as Invalids Walk for a long period. Now, continue further up the pathway and you'll see another popular Bournemouth landmark, the Aviary. The Bournemouth Aviaries existed on Pine Walk in the Lower Gardens for more than 50 years. It was originally maintained by Bournemouth Council, but is now run entirely by volunteers, and of course donations are therefore very welcome. Most of the birds you'll see are rescued or have been born at the aviary. The original building was designed in the 1930s, and when viewed from above it has a similar shape to that of a bird in flight. As you face the aviary, the left side or left wing is the enclosure where they keep the small and timid birds. The other side, the right wing, is bigger, and that houses the parrots and more aggressive large birds. Travel on a further short distance and you'll see the Aviary Gallery area, which often has art for sale from local artists. Proceed through the art area and you'll now come to Westover Road. This road is the site of one of Bournemouth's first and most important roads. And we must give the credit for this to two people, Sir George Taps Jervis and the wonderfully named Dr. Augustus Bozzy Granville. Although Lewis Tregonwell was an important figure in the founding of Bournemouth, Jervis was very much the catalyst for further development. Jervis quickly recognised that the area, although then desolate, had the potential to attract what he would call a superior class of wealthy people. He laid out plans for a marine village, which commenced with the aforementioned Westover villas that occupied the site you are now facing. All he lacked really was publicity, and in a masterstroke he invited a one Dr. Augustus Bozzy Granville to stay in one of the Westover villas. Granville enjoyed a great reputation as an author of a well-respected and influential book called The Popular Spas of England. Jervis's hospitality paid off, as Bournemouth featured very favourably in Granville's second edition. And it was this more than anything else that put the town on the map as the perfect place for people with health problems, especially chest complaints, which were far more common in the 19th century than today. This ends Audio Point 5. To reach Audio Point 6, St Peter's Church, continue left along Westover Road for about 50 yards. Then turn right into Jervis Place at the traffic lights opposite the Tourist Information Centre. The entrance to the church is directly ahead of you. Audio Point 6, St Peter's Church. You should now be standing by the front entrance of St Peter's Church at the junction of Jervis Place and Hinton Road. This is the site of the first church in Bournemouth and served as the only burial place between the years 1845 to 1878. The building of the church here first started as a shell in 1841 by Sir George Jervis, a wealthy landowner. However, he never got to see the complete church as he died a year later in 1842. It actually took another 3 years until final completion and was then consecrated by the Bishop of Winchester in 1845. However, the early days of the church did not augur well. The initial church design was much disliked, and it was described as plain, ugly and Gothic. There was little decoration, and it was considered very plain and austere. Indeed, the church remained empty, with no parson, parsonage or church school, as it only offered a very small endowment, this making it an unattractive living for any clergyman. However, things were to change for the good, as more exclusive seaside villas were being built in the Westover area. As a result, the population began to grow rapidly, and the need for a suitable place of worship became paramount. In fact, the population during this time grew from fewer than 700 in 1851 to nearly 2,000 in 1861. So naturally, improvements to the first church were made, with the final touch being the addition of the spire you see today in 1879. And what's particularly interesting is the spire is exactly 202 feet tall. This is exactly half the height of the spire at Salisbury Cathedral. There are many celebrities associated with the church, and it's well worth spending more time here if you wish to find more details about the people I mention, particularly those buried here. To do so, simply carry on to the right of the church for about 30 yards. There, at the edge of the grassed area, you'll see a glass-fronted information panel giving more details. Well, hopefully the name Mary Shelley springs to mind. Yes, Mary Shelley, the 17-year-old author of Frankenstein, lies buried in the graveyard. There's also Lewis Tregonwell, the founder of Bournemouth. When he died in 1832, he was actually buried at Cranbourne Lodge. However, his widow Henrietta had his remains moved to a tomb in the graveyard. It's well worth seeing. Inside the church, there's a side chapel in memory of John Keble. He was Professor of Poetry at Oxford who founded the Oxford movement. And finally, inside the church, there is a brass plate on an end stall commemorating the fact that William Gladstone, the former Liberal Prime Minister, took his last communion here shortly before his death in 1898. This ends audio point 6. However, I strongly recommend that you spend some more time at this church. Go inside and see the beautiful decorations, or spend a little bit more time wandering around the beautiful graveyard. The next audio point is close by, and only needs you to turn around. Then you'll be facing the other imposing building in Jervis Place, Beale's the department store. Audio point 7. Beale's department store. You should now be facing Beale's department store, one of Bournemouth's oldest stores. It seems that every town or city has its own store that's synonymous with the local area, that often quirky store that seems to have grown with the location. And in the case of Bournemouth, Beale's is that example. Our story starts with John Elmes Beale working for the drapers John Russell in his hometown of Weymouth. Working his way up to shop manager, he asked for a junior partnership, only to be rebuffed, and this prompted him to seeking a place where he could set up his own business. Having agreed not to compete with John Russell in Weymouth, Beale looked at other towns. These included Dorchester, Shaftesbury, Poole, Swanage and Southampton. But eventually he decided on Bournemouth, probably because it was expanding rapidly. Initially, Beale rented space in St Peter's Terrace, which was a new building put up on the site of two large houses, and he did this with an initial capital of £400. He opened his first shop called Fancy Fair in November 1881. Trading was difficult at first, but the opening of the Bournemouth West Railway Station in 1874 had fuelled a growth in excursion trips to the resort, hence more potential customers. So, Beale took advantage of this situation, and being a typical entrepreneur of his times, he offered what the public wanted. For example, in 1884 the shop produced the first of its special resort souvenirs, and this included an album of views of the town. And then later that year he had the first ever in-store Father Christmas of any store in the country. And the Beale's family use of the marketing advantages brought about by Father Christmas didn't stop there, as Father Christmas in the form of Cyril Beale appeared by air one year and flew over the store on a plane that later landed at nearby Eyford. John Beale eventually went on to become Mayor of Bournemouth in 1902, 3 and 4. He eventually died aged 80 in 1928 in Boscombe, Bournemouth, Hampshire. However, as you can see, his legacy lives on, with the current store, one of over 30 in the country, still thriving after all these years. This ends audio point 7. To reach audio point 8, the Bournemouth Town Hall, it's a much longer trek than previous one. With Beale's on your left, proceed down the pedestrianised area of Old Christchurch Road, passing under a clock. Proceed past Lush, and then a series of bus stops to your left. This brings you to the corner of the Bournemouth Square, which is dominated by the Obscura Cafe. You should now see 2 telephone boxes opposite a Tesco Express, a short distance ahead. Looking beyond these telephone boxes, you should see an imposing building about 150 yards on, with a flagpole on its roof. This is the next audio stop, the Bournemouth Town Hall. Audio point 8, the Bournemouth Town Hall. You should now be standing outside the imposing building that is now Bournemouth Town Hall, at the junction of Bradley Road and Bourne Avenue, directly opposite the Bournemouth War Memorial. In local government, the Town Hall is usually the chief administrative building of a town or city, and consequently it often reflects the status of the town. It's usually big and very imposing. But I'm sure you'll agree that the building you see now is undoubtedly a fine one, but it doesn't really cry out municipal building. And the reason for this is simple. The building you see now wasn't built to be the town hall. It in fact started life as a very prestigious hotel by the name of Mont d'Or. The foundation stone was laid by King Oscar of Sweden in 1881. And it opened as the Mont d'Or Hotel in 1885, and it was actually named after the French spa town in the Auvergne, which pioneered the Mont d'Or cure, hence the slightly French look. It was built as a sumptuous health spa primarily for rich consumptives of the time, and it was built by Dr. Horace Doble, who was one of the first 4 doctors in Bournemouth, and it was built next to a sanatorium, in which was then called Sanatorium Road, and it acclaimed worldwide fame. Of course, this prestigious health spa fitted in very well with the impression Bournemouth was trying to develop as a popular health resort. The hotel itself was ahead of its time, and it prided itself particularly on the excellence of its baths, and claimed to have the most perfect system of baths in the whole of the United Kingdom. And indeed it may have done, because it featured over 20 different methods. Amongst these were Turkish baths, douche, needle, plunge, pine and seawater, the latter pumped up from the nearby ocean. The hotel offered treatments for gout, rheumatism and other breathing ailments. Indeed, water was even imported from the world-famous springs in Auvergne, France, which was an area well known for its health-giving properties. However, its other main claim to fame I think is more interesting, and it's the fact that it was the 3rd place in the United Kingdom to have a telephone, with the simple number 3 as its number. The hotel lasted until World War I, when it was used as a hospital for British and Indian soldiers. Then for a short while it became a convalescent home, finally being purchased by Bournemouth Council in 1919 and featuring as the actual town hall from November 1921. However, what's really interesting about the building is the fact that it's noted for its many ghost stories, probably due to the fact that it was a convalescent home and a sanatorium. These feature the usual patrolling soldiers, nurses, black cats, and if you wish to find out more, there's an excellent leaflet detailing many of the ghostly tales in the nearby main Bournemouth Library. But one ghostly tale features more prominently, that of a soldier who appears every year on the 31st of October helping himself to a drink of water. So check the date. You might be lucky enough to see him. This ends audio point 8. To reach audio point 9, the War Memorial and Central Gardens, simply cross the road and then proceed down a short set of steps. Audio point 9, the Bournemouth War Memorial and Central Gardens. You should now be at audio point 9 by the War Memorial in the Central Gardens. The Bournemouth War Memorial, which you see in front of you, has been listed as a Grade 2 building. It's part of the English Heritage Scheme to list up to 500 war memorials a year over the next 5 years to mark the centenary of the First World War. This memorial of 1920 to 22 has survived exceptionally well, and it's a very poignant reminder of the impact of the First and Second World Wars on the local community. And it contains 2 bronze plaques that commemorate fallen servicemen from both the World Wars. It's designed in a classical style, and it was designed by the architect Albert Shervey. In particular, look at the high level of architectural and artistic interest shown by the pair of stone Canova lions, sculptured by W.H. Hall, a well-known and highly skilled memorial mason. These lions are seen guarding the memorial, with one of the lions sleeping whilst the other is roaring. With its associated stone steps, enclosure and balustrade, the memorial compares well with other Grade 2 listed First World War memorials, and it stands in a prominent position in the very heart of Bournemouth. Now let's turn and face towards the town centre. You'll see a very popular part of what is now known as the Central Gardens. These gardens are meticulously maintained as part of the Council's Gardens of Excellence initiative. They were designed by Decimus Burton, who was at the time employed by the local Merrick estate. Burton is also famous for his other contribution to the landscape of Bournemouth, namely Westover Gardens. In this instance, the Merrick estate granted permission for the area to be made into public pleasure gardens. As a result, Burton laid out new walks, plantations and flower beds. Over the ensuing years, further leases were given that have created the 3 kilometres of landscape gardens that feature the lower, central and upper gardens that you see now. So, let us now spend a little time enjoying the flora and fauna as you proceed towards the pergola, which is about 50 yards further on. And as you make your way, take note in particular details on the 4 commemorative plaques by the pathways to your right. These all give details of trees planted. And so, we reach the pergola. And what you're actually seeing is an excellent example of sympathetic recycling. You're really seeing an old veranda from a Victorian building that was salvaged from demolition when the nearby Sovereign Centre in Boscombe was being built. Another example of such recycling is the clock above the cafe in the square. It's the Captain Norton clock that originally appeared above a shelter in the middle of the square in 1925. This clock adorned the top of a shelter until it was removed and mounted on a tall pedestal that sat in the middle of a large traffic roundabout that was created in the square in 1948. And this tower briefly gained attention when it was discovered just before being dismantled to be leaning by 18 degrees. So it seems that Bournemouth had for a brief time failed to take advantage of the tourism possibilities from having the Leaning Tower of Bournemouth. Eventually, in February 2000, the newly pedestrianised square was officially opened, with the Norton clock featuring again, and it now survives on top of the Obscura Cafe. ends audio point 9, and in fact brings the guided tour to a close. I do hope that you've enjoyed the tour, and you now feel much more inclined to discover more of this lovely seaside resort for yourself. So, I bid you farewell, and hope you have a great time in Bournemouth.